Great. Shalom. I think you are.
Chag Sameach, everyone, almost. Ladies and gentlemen, we welcome you. We're glad to have you with us here tonight as we're about to begin the Mincha service. Friends, we're going to invite you all to turn to page 1 in your Sim Shalom prayer books. Again, welcoming those who are in the sanctuary, those who are joining us via live stream. Good to have you all with us tonight. Page 1, Ashrei.
Ashrei Yoshvei Beitecha, Yalalu Chasela.
Ashrei
תהילת אדוני ידבר פיו, וברך הבשר שם קודשו לעולם ועד. ואנחנו נברך ים מעתה ועד עולם. הללויה.
Please rise.
יגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה.
Amen.
בעלמא דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי. וחיי כל ויומי כל וחיי לכל בית ישראל. Bagalav zman karim yimeru amen.
Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabbah Mevorach, Elam Umayah Yiparach.
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי לקודשה בריחו
Richu.
להאל אמן כה ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה אמירם ויומה ויאמרו אמן.
Amen. Page 3.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו אלוהי אברהם אלוהי יצחק ואלוהי יעקב האל הגדול הגיבור והנורא אל עליון גומל חסדים טובים וקונה יעקב וזוכה חסדי אבות ומביא גואל לבני בניהם למען שמו באהבה מלך עוזר ומושיע ומגן ברוך אתה אדוני מגן אברהם אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני, מחיה מתים אתה, רב להושיע, מכלכל חיים בחסד, מחיה מתים ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ורופא חולים ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בגבורות ומדום מלך, מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה. ונאמן אתה לחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני, מחיי המתים.
Amen. Nekadesh Yisrael Olam, Hashem Shema Kishim Torah Shemarom, ככתוב היד לביאך וכרזל זה ויאמר.
ככתוב היד לביאך וכרזל זה ויאמר.
קדוש, 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 אדוני צבאות מלוך עצמדו.
ויומתם ברוך ימינו.
אדוני מלחמו.
ודברי קודשך כתוב לאמור.
מלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהי אקסיון לדור. Hallelujah.
ימלוך אדוני לעולם, אלוהי אקסיון לדור ודור. הללויה, לדור ודור נגיד גודלך. ולנס הנצחים קדושתך נקדיש ושבחך. אלוהינו מפין לא ימוש לעולם ועד. כי מלך גדול וקדוש אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני. האל הקדוש.
Amen.
אל תחנן ועמדה.
Friends, we continue with the Kaddish Shalem on page 10.
יגדל ויתקלה שמי רבה, עד
Amen.
ברח חירותי וימיך מלכותי, וחייכון ומכון חיים חובי ישראל בגלל זמן קריב ימרו.
Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach. Leolam leomei omaya yitbarach.
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו ויעלה מן כה וכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה אמירם ביומה ויאמרו אמן תתקבל סלותה ונבואות כל ישראל קודם אבון וישמעיה ויאמרו
Amen.
שלום הרב משמעי וחיים עלינו וכל ישראל ויאמרו
Amen.
עושה שלום ממרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו וכל ישראל ויאמרו
Amen. Page 11.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל לתת גדולה יוצר בראשית שלא עשנו ויהי ארצות ולא שמנו כמשפחות ואדמה שלא שם חלקנו כהם וגור עלינו ככל עמונם אנחנו קוראים משתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. וזה שמיים ויוסר ארץ ובשם על שנות אלוהינו הכתוב בתורת ובדתיים ושבעת אלוהים באשר על כן יכבד אחד ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד.
Mourner's Kaddish on page 12. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah
אמן.
ve'alma divrach hirutei ve'amlich malchutei v'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael ba'agala uv'izman kor'i v'imeru amen.
אמן.
Yehei shmei rabbah mevorach le'olam u'lamei omaya yitzarach v'yitzabach v'yithoar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shmei dekudesha brichu liela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran be'olma v'yimeru amen.
אמן.
Yehei shlama rabba min shmaya v'chayim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'yimeru amen. Oseh shalom b'mimav uyaseh shalom aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael v'yimeru amen. Shkoch. thank the cantor for leading us in the Mincha service. Friends, welcome everybody. We are delighted to welcome everybody to our annual Tikkun Leil Shavuot. I don't remember how many years ago it was, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, I don't recall, where instead of beginning the Tikkun Leil Shavuot at the conclusion of the Mariv service, we started beginning it early, right after Mincha, and for all those years, the first session of the Tikkun between Mincha and Mariv has been graciously led by Razy Weiss. So I want to thank Razy for leading this first session of the Tikkun, as she's done for the last many years at this particular time. We appreciate you, Razy, and we're glad to see everybody with us, those here who are with us in the sanctuary, and those joining us via live stream. If you're joining us via live stream, just give a wave so we can all see you and acknowledge you. Never fails to get a laugh. Friends, this evening, I just want to review the schedule with you. We're going to begin, we're going to call on Razy in just a moment, who will be leading us in the session, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik on Zionism, his two concepts of covenant. At 9 o'clock, Cantor Weiss will lead us in the Mariv service from about 9 to 9:15. 9:15 to 9:30, we will have the first round of Shavuot refreshments, which is a big deal because the first time in this 4 years that we can have food at the Tikkun. Remember, for the first 2 years of the pandemic, we had what I affectionately call the pre-kun, because we had it the night before. We had it before the night before Shavuot, because we didn't want to be using our electronics on the holiday. And then last year we were not able to have food when we were back in the building. So we're glad to have you in the building, serve real Shavuot foods, and to conduct real in-person learning the way that Tikkun was meant to be. Nothing wrong with a pre-kun, but the Tikkun is far superior. Then following the refreshments at 9:30, the cantor will be leading a session called Aramaic Today. I'll follow the cantor with what we're calling Jewish Law and Artificial Intelligence. And then we'll have a little more Shavuot refreshments. And then we'll be calling upon our rabbinic intern, Sammy Vingran, to teach a session, what does it mean that we all stood at Mount Sinai? So we hope that you'll be with us, stay as long as you like. We expect the evening to go to around 11:30, 11:45 or so. And most of all, we're delighted to have everybody with us here, whether in the building or joining us over live stream. My great pleasure now to call upon Dr. Razy Weiss. Friends, Razy is too nice and polite to ask. Me, a little less so. So if you wouldn't mind, if everybody could just come up a little bit, if you wouldn't mind. Which is weird because it's my eyesight that's getting worse, not Razy's. But if you wouldn't mind, please come closer.
Hi everyone, Chag Sameach. Of course, I spent a little time trying to think about what to speak about tonight, and I thought, well, it's Shavuot, it's the celebration of Matan Torah, it's the celebration of the covenant between God and the Jewish people that is the Torah itself. So I thought, well, why don't I speak about the concept of covenant and what a covenant entails? Coincidentally, it's always interesting how these things happen, but coincidentally, just a week or two after I had come up with this idea that I would speak about covenant, I happened to hear a lecture that actually dealt with the topic of covenant. It was a lecture sponsored by my son-in-law's father in memory of his wife, my son-in-law's mother. He sponsors a lecture every year in her honor and her memory. And it was delivered by a woman, an Israeli scholar named Tanya White. And her topic, her main interest is the work of Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the late Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. That's her main focus. And interestingly, what her topic was the way in which Rabbi Sachs's work reflects the work of Rabbi Soloveitchik, and in particular that he has taken from Rabbi Soloveitchik the notion of two different kinds of covenant that exist between God and the Jewish people. So all I had to do was hear the word two covenants, and I thought, aha, okay, now we're cooking. Okay, so now I'm on my way to this lecture tonight. And I was put in mind of Rabbi Soloveitchik's lecture, which then, of course, became a published essay, as most of his lectures did. It's one that I'd read many years ago, and it's the one that introduced the notion of two covenants. And so I thought, well, why don't I talk to you about that original lecture. It was delivered in 1956. It was delivered at a Yom HaAtzmaut celebration at Yeshiva University. And it was delivered in Hebrew. So it has since been translated twice, pretty well. I don't think perfectly, but it has been translated twice. And it's a very well-known essay of his. And of course, we see that Rabbi Sachs leaned on it heavily for his own philosophy and his own writing. This essay that I'm talking about, it was originally the lecture that was delivered on Yom HaAtzmaut. It's called Kol Dodi Dofek. I'll talk in a little bit about how to translate that phrase, Kol Dodi Dofek, but it's a phrase that comes from Shir HaShirim, from the book Song of Songs, the biblical book Song of Songs, and it figures very prominently both in Soloveitchik's general philosophy and in particular in his Zionism, as we'll see in just a bit. So I want you, as I talk about it, I want you to bear in mind that this was delivered in 1956. So after the establishment of the State of Israel, but before, some of the other major things. So it was actually delivered Yom HaAtzmaut, so it preceded the Sinai campaign. It certainly preceded the Six-Day War. So it's very interesting to see how prescient he was and how appreciative he was of the miracles of 1948, not waiting till 1967 to say how miraculous the State of Israel is. Okay, let me start by just giving you just a very brief background of Rabbi Soloveitchik, known widely as the Rav, just simply the Rav. That's Rabbi Soloveitchik. He was born in 1903, and he lived in a small town in Russia, which is now, the town is now in Belarus. He was a brilliant student, a brilliant Talmud scholar, and eventually he outstripped his teachers, and his father took him on as a student. After his initial being steeped in Jewish subjects, he went to Germany to study at university, and he went to Berlin, and he eventually got a PhD there at the Friedrich Wilhelm University in 1932. Here's another coincidence. It's always striking when there are coincidences. For those of you who saw the Jewish Berlin virtual tour last a week and a half ago, I guess, it ended with a mention of Soloveitchik. So I was, again, so surprised. it mentioned the very last stop on the tour was the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary, and it was a very the tour guide Yoav Sapir actually mentioned that Soloveitchik had been a student there, and that was virtually the last thing he said in this virtual tour. So that was striking to me as well. But it was a very interesting institution, this Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary, in that it insisted that its students master secular wisdom, secular subjects, no less than rabbinical or religious subjects. And in fact, it would not ordain anyone who did not have a PhD. Anybody who graduated from this institute was a doctor rabbi or rabbi doctor, okay, but never just the one or the other. So this was an institute where Soloveitchik was a student. Okay. Eventually, he left Berlin before the war. He left Berlin. He went to the States, initially to Boston, and he made great innovations in education in Boston. He started the first co-ed day school, what we would now call a day school, the Maimonides School, and in it he had Talmud taught both to boys and girls, which was astonishing, and still to this day is resisted in many quarters. And he allowed them even to study together, to study Talmud together, boys and girls. So that was quite an innovation. He was nevertheless very strictly Orthodox, despite these major innovations, and his interest in secular studies was always a sticking point for him in the Orthodox community. He was not always accepted, as one would think that his stature in Talmud would make him. Okay, let's, and also his great Zionism, that was also something that set him apart from many in the religious camp. Okay, now just let's talk for a moment about the title of the essay. The title of the essay is Kol Dodi Dofek. It's usually translated, the voice or the sound of my beloved knocks. K-N-O-C-K-S. I don't know, that doesn't sound right to me. So I think maybe a better translation is to read it a little differently and to say, Kol, a sound. Dodi Dofek, my beloved is knocking. It's my beloved who's knocking. Right? So the recognition, like a hark kind of thing, and my beloved is knocking. And this phrase comes, as I said, from Shir HaShirim, and it signifies the importance for Soloveitchik of answering the call directly, immediately. Okay? If your lover comes knocking at your door, your beloved comes knocking at your door, then answer the door. Okay? Actually, in Shir HaShirim, we are told that the beloved had been absent for a long time, and the lover is in her bedroom, and he comes knocking at the door, and she doesn't answer. She had been yearning for him, loving him, wanting him, but at that moment, she was tired, maybe she wasn't dressed, maybe her makeup wasn't on, whatever it is, she didn't answer. And for Soloveitchik, this is a colossal sin on the part of the Jewish people if when God knocks, we don't answer. If when God knocks, we don't answer immediately. Okay, let's turn now to the two covenants. The two covenants that Soloveitchik talks about are, in his words, as I told you, this was a talk in Hebrew, Brit Goral, which means a covenant of fate, F-A-T-E, covenant of fate, and the other covenant is called Brit Ye'ud, which has been translated by these translators that I mentioned earlier as covenant of destiny. Well, I have a little trouble hearing a really big difference between those two terms, fate and destiny. I'm destined to something, I'm fated to something. They sound too close to me, and I think too close for what Soloveitchik intended. I'm not sure how he would have translated it, but I'm going to say covenant of mission. Okay, so we'll translate the first one as it's been translated as covenant of fate, and the second one covenant of mission. And Soloveitchik identifies the covenant of fate with the covenant between God and the Jewish people in Egypt, and the covenant of mission with the covenant between God and the Jewish people at Sinai. Okay, so let's talk about what Soloveitchik means by the terms fate and mission. Okay? Fate existence, he says, is when people see themselves as being affected by things. Okay? So when we see ourselves as things happen to us, we are in our fate mode. Okay? We experience ourselves as passive bearers of whatever befalls us, whether it is good or bad. If people in this situation where we are experiencing ourselves as recipients of whatever happens, passive recipients of whatever happens, if we come together under those circumstances, we come together because of these external influences. We are kind of compelled to come together. Even so, we become responsible for one another, but that mutual responsibility was not self-generated, but was generated by outside forces. Of course, outside forces always hold us responsible for one another. What one Jew does, every Jew is responsible for. So there's this funny thing that both they make us feel responsible for one another, and these external forces also see us and hold us responsible for one another. In fate existence, in this mode of existence, Goral, the fate, we are not drawn to each other because of a common goal or a common mission. We are drawn to each other because of outside forces that are working on us. And of course, in all of our persecutions and all of our sufferings, all through the centuries, all through the millennia, there have been these external forces that have forced us to unite when otherwise we would not have been united. In mission existence, we have a very different situation. In mission existence, we see ourselves as determining our own course, not as things happening to us, but see ourselves as in charge. We have a self, an I, that acts, that exercises free choice, and in this way, when we are in mission existence, we're not simply reacting to whatever is happening to us, but we are taking charge. And in this kind of existence, we are able to devote ourselves to a higher cause, to a sacred cause. And this is what the covenant at Sinai was supposed to do. It was supposed to elevate us to the point where we join together in a common goal, that goal being getting closer to God, perfecting ourselves, perfecting the world, improving the world at large. The covenant of fate is the covenant in Egypt, because in Egypt, God took us to be his people, didn't ask us anything. We had no volition in that covenant. But if we think about the covenant at Sinai, Moshe presented the Torah to us. Do we want it? And we said, Na'aseh v'nishma, we want it. We will do it, we will obey. That exercise of volition, that exercise of our free will, is what makes the covenant at Sinai a covenant of volition. Much of the essay is devoted to the question of suffering. It starts off with the question of suffering, and it's pervaded by this question of suffering. In particular, of course, the suffering of the righteous. Why do the righteous suffer? And Soloveitchik says there's no answer to that question. No answer that any human being can give that's satisfactory to that question of why the righteous suffer. But in Judaism, we don't need to answer that question. We don't need to know why the righteous suffer. We need to know what to do when we suffer. We need to know how to step up and use that suffering to make something meaningful. So this, you can see, this is this mission existence where something happens to us, but as a result of something happening to us, we take charge. The question we ask ourselves is, what am I supposed to do now? What am I being called upon to do? How do I invest this suffering with some sort of meaning? How do I elevate this experience of suffering into something in which I am in charge, in which I am expressing my love for God, my appreciation for God, and not wallow in what has happened to me. When one thing that Soloveitchik is very clear on is that there is suffering. We're not supposed to sweep it under the table. We're not supposed to pretty it up. We're not supposed to say, oh, it's really good, only we don't see why it's good. No, none of those kinds of moves are things that he will tolerate. But what he says is that Judaism requires of us that we respond to suffering not as reactors, but as actors. Okay, so rather than say what we all say when we suffer, why me? Or why is there suffering, if we want to be more broad-minded about it? Instead of saying that, we say, what do I do with my suffering? How do I respond to it? How do I improve myself, my world, and others? How do I bring all of us closer to God? I think, it's a little bit like on Yom Kippur, we make ourselves suffer so that we can look into our souls and so that we can examine ourselves and see where can we go from here. And even when suffering happens to us, that's something that we can do with it. We can interpret suffering as a spur to action. We can ask, instead of why me or why is there suffering in the world, we can ask, what is being asked of me? What must I do now? How should I change? How can I make the world better? When Soloveitchik analyzes the situation of Job, what he says is that as long as Job was asking this theoretical question, this metaphysical question of why is there suffering, he didn't get anywhere. The turning point for Job, says Soloveitchik, is when he took action. When he did something at the very end of this very long book of Job, when he did something to improve the situation of his friends, then everything turned around. Then he was rewarded twofold for all of his suffering. Okay, now not only suffering demands of us that we step up to the plate, as it were. The other thing, the second thing that Soloveitchik talks about that calls upon us to step up to the plate is blessing. Blessing and bounty. When good things happen to us, how do we react to that? Do we just say, oh, this is great? We don't ask the question, well, why did this happen to me, right? We don't ask that in the case of blessing. But Soloveitchik says blessing is not unconditional. Blessing is that same sort of call. What can I do? What must I do? What does Judaism require of me at this point? Because I was given all of this bounty. This was the problem again with Job. He was so blessed. But did he ask, what am I supposed to do with all the good things that I have? He didn't ask that question until, of course, the very end of the book. So the mission response to blessing, like the mission response to suffering, is action, is doing good in the world. Then there's yet another thing besides suffering and blessing that makes the same sort of demand on us, and that is a miracle. If we witness a miracle, that is the time for us to say, what does this demand of me? If I am privileged to live in a time when I am an eyewitness to miracles, I'm not supposed to just bask in the miracle. I'm supposed to ask myself, what does this mean for me? What am I supposed to do as a result of having had this miraculous experience? This is where Soloveitchik Zionism comes in. He sees the establishment of the state of Israel as a miraculous event. He doesn't see any other way of explaining it. It's a miraculous event, and as a miraculous event, it calls upon us to do a lot, to settle the land, to support the land, to give and give and give, because that is what a miracle calls upon us to do. So I want you to remember this is 1956, and in 1956 he is still overwhelmed by the miracle of the establishment of the state of Israel. And he talks about all the miracles involved in the establishment of the state of Israel. The first thing he says is, when have Russia and the Western nations come together to support anything? Especially during the Cold War. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. There's no other way to explain it. And then I have this really interesting quote where he says about the United Nations, he says, I am inclined to believe, I'm quoting him now, I am inclined to believe that the United Nations was created specifically for this end, for the sake of fulfilling the mission that divine providence had placed upon it. It appears to me that one cannot point to any other concrete accomplishment on the part of the United Nations. So it's a miracle. Okay, the second thing he says is, it's a miracle. How were the people of Israel triumphant, victorious in this war? It's a miracle. We have to take notice of that, and we have to do something. The third thing he says, had the Arabs not rejected the partition plan, oh my God, right? Where would Israel be? It would be a disaster. They would have no access to Jerusalem, the Galilee, the Negev. It's only because the Arabs rejected the partition plan. And why did they reject the partition plan? Because God hardened their hearts. Just as he did with Pharaoh in Egypt, so that he would perform all these miracles and then the Jews could leave for good. Here too, he hardened their hearts. He made them not agree to the partition plan, and then a miracle. Next, he says, for the first time ever, the Jews showed the world that Jewish blood is not cheap. A miracle. And he goes on at great length to talk about the sacred obligation we have to defend ourselves, our lives, and our property. That Judaism requires of us that we defend ourselves, not just our lives, but also our property. And the fifth miracle, he says, for the first time ever, Jews expelled from the countries in which they live have a place to go. A miracle. I noticed as I was reading this essay, I had read it many years ago, but as I read it again for now, I noticed that there were two rabbinic ideas, two rabbinic notions that were familiar to me from other contexts that Soloveitchik uses in his own way, but he doesn't directly refer to them. One of them, they're both found in the Midrash. One of them is found in Bereshit Rabbah. It's the concept, it's called in Hebrew, litzaref et habriot, which means to purify the creatures, God's creatures, namely us. The idea, the context in which it's raised in the Midrash is, why were the mitzvot, in particular the ritual mitzvot, why were they issued? What's their point? What's the point of the ritual mitzvot? And the answer the rabbis give is litzaref et habriot. That is, to purify us, even if there's no, kind of logical reason for a particular mitzvah, nevertheless it has an effect on us. That is, it spurs us to refine ourselves or to become purified or elevated. Soloveitchik uses that same notion. He uses that word a few times, litzaref, he uses that word a few times he uses it as the answer to the question of why is there suffering. For him, the reason there is suffering is so that we will do that for ourselves, so that we will refine ourselves. The second idea, and of course you've heard this already, this is found in the Mechilta. The second thing he talks about, that the rabbis have talked about, is this idea that we find in the Mechilta on Parashat Bo. It's this notion of mitzvah haba'a liyadcha al tachmitzena, okay, which means when a mitzvah comes to you, as a mitzvah is at hand, you are not supposed to delay it. You're not supposed to delay the fulfillment of that mitzvah. If it's here, you do it now. You don't delay it. This idea derives in a very cute way. The rabbis are very cute. It derives in a cute way from a play on words. We have a verse in Exodus that says, you shall keep, Ushmartem et hamatzot. Okay? You should keep watch over the matzahs that they not ferment. Okay? And the rabbi says, in particular Rabbi Yoshia, whom Rashi quotes on this verse, Rabbi Yoshia says, don't read matzot, read mitzvot. Okay? Don't allow your mitzvah to ferment. When it comes to your hand, do it right away. And the word al tachmitzena, don't let it become chametz. When a mitzvah comes to you, act on it immediately. We don't let a mitzvah sit around waiting to be accomplished. Soloveitchik turns this idea into what he calls hachmatzat hasha'ah, allowing the moment to ferment. When that moment is there, you have to step up to the plate immediately and act on it. Don't allow that moment to ferment. By taking action in response to suffering, we are fulfilling the covenant at Sinai, the covenant of action. And when God is near and calling us, and we step right up to the plate, this too is the covenant at Sinai, where we announce ourselves ready and willing. If we don't respond to the call with action, we may lose our opportunity. After all, it is our beloved who is knocking. Thank you. Okay. I would love to have questions about Soloveitchik, about Kol Dodi Dofek, about the covenants, whatever you would like to ask. Rabbi?
Back in the 1950s, when Rabbi Soloveitchik basically came out and said his religious significance to the state of Israel, as in the political area, that was not the normative position in the Orthodox world.
Right. He was much vilified for it, and he was ostracized. And there were. I mean, it's kind of sad, you know. There would be functions where all the great rabbis would gather, and they wouldn't invite him. And actually, I happen to know. I shouldn't know this, but I heard gossip. I heard gossip at a shiva house.
What happens in the sanctuary?
Yeah. So I heard that what they did was the women would invite his wife, but the rabbis wouldn't invite him. That was the way they handled it. Not to completely snub him, but not to invite him.
Yet, for most of modern centrist orthodoxy, they ended up adopting and really embracing this philosophy.
Right, and it's centrist orthodoxy that's vilified. Right, obviously, it's centrist orthodoxy that's vilified by the right-wing orthodoxy. They hold him responsible, in fact, for all these rabbis who are centrist in their approach. Yeah, because he ordained, I don't know, at least 200, maybe more rabbis, and they walk that middle path. They walk that middle path. You know, his rabbis. They don't like that. They don't approve of secular study unless it furthers your Torah study, you know, or you need it to earn a living. He didn't take that position. teaching women Talmud. Are you kidding? You know, these are really radical things that he did.
Discussion, somewhat privy to among conservative rabbis, thinking about the religious nature of the religious significance of the state of Israel. It's the axiomatic in the conservative movement that there is religious significance in the state of Israel. So let's say the famous verse in the Tikkun that Israel is Reshit Tzmichat Gulateinu. Beginning of beginning of the flourishing of our exile, of our redemption. Excuse me. That's why there's a prayer in our prayer in the Siddur. Certainly reflects that. But it seems that there are some even within the conservative movement who love Israel, committed to Israel, but who are have trouble with a theological level, attributing the type of religious significance that was normative for the last generation or two in Central Orthodoxy and the conservative movement to Israel today.
Yeah. For Soloveitchik, the state of Israel was God knocking at the door, and our not responding with a full heart to that is a great sin. So he really is, quite unique in that way. Oh, so yeah, but the question is, what role did his secular learning play in his life? Okay, in Yeshiva University, secular learning is taken as valuable in itself. Okay, at Yeshiva University, where Soloveitchik was, I'm not so sure one could say that about the Chabad movement.
Where do we get the assumption and understanding that the anti-Zionism is Jewish anti-Zionism is a feature of Hasidic or Satmar philosophy? If, as you're saying, it was a feature of standard Orthodox.
Yeah,
When did that change?
Soloveitchik was a Brisker, and they're fervent anti-Zionists. So, I don't know. It's hard to know why that happened, but so it is. Yes, Sam.
I recently read a very good article by Shavuot, an amazing scholar, on the Slonimer Rebbe, a very important Hasidic Rebbe who I think lived during the Shoah and later. And the article was called "The Shoah, the Holocaust, the Inverted Miracle," because the question is, how can God allow this to happen, and did God cause this? And according to the scholar, the Slonimer Rebbe, this great rabbi, said that the Shoah is an inverted miracle. So a miracle would be something that's outside history, something that goes beyond everything that is normal, everything that is humanly understandable, and so on. And so Israel would be a very positive miracle, something that is outside history, but changes history. And the Shoah, in all its monstrosity, would be the inverted, the negative miracle. But the Shoah in Israel would be the horizon, maybe, in a way, of where for Jewish faith today and in the future, and Jewish theology. And my question really is, would you agree with that? How would that sit with you, so to say?
Okay, so I'm more comfortable saying what I think Soloveitchik would say about that, because I'm not speaking for myself today. So his view of the Holocaust, like all suffering, is that we can't understand it. That's number one. We can't hope with our limited understanding to understand why there's evil of that dimension in the world. But the Jewish response to the Holocaust has to be the same thing that we do on Yom Kippur. The Jewish response to the Holocaust has to be, how do we improve ourselves? How do we improve the world? How do we act in the world to sanctify it, to bring us closer to God, to bring ourselves closer to God? That's the only thing we can do as human beings. We can't begin to understand why there's evil in the world. So that would be his approach to it. The Holocaust is something that happened to us. It's our fate. It brought us together, but that's not enough. Once we're brought together, we have to elevate that. We have to sanctify that by having a divine mission. So that's all we can do. He says we can only do what the halacha requires of us, which is to do what we're supposed to do. And there's no further answer. He even says that when Moshe says to God, show me your glory, show me your ways, that when Moshe says that to God, he's asking the suffering question. Moshe wants to understand why there's suffering in the world, and God won't answer him. Other questions? Oh, Dinah.
Why is the first of the covenants that salvation mentions Egypt? You said it's when God tells the people of Israel that they are his, but he does that with Abraham. By the time they get to Egypt, they are already a nation, and they are already people who knew God, may have lost the knowledge of God in Egypt, but they knew God, and God knew that they were his people. Wouldn't the first covenant have been with Abraham?
Oh, I didn't mean first covenant that way. I didn't mean the first covenant in time or in history. I meant the first of the two covenants that Soloveitchik is talking about.
But why would Egypt even have been a covenant? What did God say to them to make it a covenant?
He said, you are my people.
At what point does he say that?
It's in the, you can look it up. It's in the Torah. He says that, you are my people. I don't know the exact verse. But yeah. Yes, there were other covenants, and they're all very interesting. I mean, my first thought before I heard this Tanya White lecture that got me started to think about this was I was going to talk about the various covenants that there were. The covenant with Abraham, I think, is the most interesting of all of them, because it's a covenant in which it's only God who binds himself to Abraham and not the other way around. It's unique in that way. And the walking between the pieces, you know, the Brit Bein Habitarim, that the pieces of meat that are cut, the significance of the pieces is that what you're saying when you enter a covenant is, if I don't abide by the conditions of the covenant, may this happen to me. That's the kind of significance of the pieces. And we even have that expression of cutting a deal, right? It all comes back to all the way back to this, where there was a cutting. In the covenant with Abraham, what's interesting is that Abraham doesn't walk through the pieces. Okay? He sleeps, and the tanur, the furnace, goes through the pieces as if representing God. So, kiviyachol, as if God is the one who, if he doesn't keep his end of the deal, he's the one who this would happen to. So it's a very, very interesting covenant. Really distinctive. I think there's nothing like it. Are we good? Any other questions?
Yeah, one over there.
One, okay, yeah.
Do you happen to know Rabbi Soloveitchik's Talmud study? What was his PhD in?
Yeah, it was in several things. Philosophy was one of them. Trying to think. I think there was I know his dissertation was on Hermann Cohen, the neo-Kantian philosopher. So basically was in philosophy. There were like one or two other things tagged onto it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention and your questions.
We want to thank Razy for leading the first session of our Tikkun, as she has so graciously done for the last several years. Razy, we appreciate you. We appreciate all of your learning, and your sharing it with us this evening. And friends, we are aware that we're having trouble with the alarm for the Sefer Torah. It was designed in such a way as to keep us on track for the Tikkun tonight. The good news is that the alarm company is aware. The bad news, according to our custodians, that they didn't come to it like they were supposed to. So I'm hoping that this will either fix itself by tomorrow morning, or it will be fixed over the Yontif after services tomorrow before Shabbat. So we thank you all for your cooperation with us. We invite everyone to please rise at this time, as we are about to begin the Mariv service. We invite you all now to turn in your Sidurim to the evening service for this evening of Shavuot. And by the way, just one thought before we begin the Mariv service. If candlelighting for Shabbat, let's make up a time, is 7 o'clock in the evening, how early can you start Shabbat? We have a long tradition in Judaism of starting Shabbat or ushering in Shabbat early. Indeed, theoretically, according to the rabbis, as early as Wednesday. I do not advise that, except for those of you with trust funds. but we have a long tradition of ushering Shabbat in early when candlelighting is late. So Shabbat can begin early. Certain of the holidays can be ushered in early. Why can't we usher in Shavuot early, relative to candlelighting, which is approximately now?
49 days have to take place.
We've been counting the Omer every night since the second day of Pesach. And the Torah says that Shavuot begins after you have completed the counting of 7 complete weeks. I mean, not 7 weeks, 6 days, and 20 a bunch of minutes, but rather literally 7 complete days, 7 complete weeks. So that's why, of all the holidays, there is a strong, not even tradition, the strong law against bringing in or ushering in the holiday early, like we might have with Shabbat or some of the other holidays. So if anybody ever wonders why we are so machmir, so strict about beginning the Mariv service for Shavuot at this rather late hour, now you know. Please rise, as on page 28 the Chazan leads us in the Baruch Hu.
Baruch Hu et Adonai המבורך.
Le'olam va'ed.
Baruch Adonai המבורך לעולם ועד.
Friends, we're seated.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בדבריו מערבים בכל שיש בנים באמפוס זמנים. שר כל משפטי בכיסי קוצך נברי יום ראש וחודש מברי. ומה ביום ולילה מעבד ביום ולילה אדוני צבאות שמו אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני, אמרי ורבי.
Amen.
אהבת
Avat olam Beit Yisrael Amcha ahavta Torah u'mitzvot chukim u'mishpatim otanu limadeta Al kein Adonai Eloheinu b'shachbeinu v'kumeinu nasiach b'rugecha ונשמח בדברי תורתך ובמצוותיך לעולם ועד. כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו ובהם נגד יומם ולילה. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל. שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני אחד. ברוך שם כבוד מוסר הבית. שאתה בלוט הידך I am Shavuot Ishmael Satai. ויאמר אדוני משה נדב אדוני אלוהיכם אמת למען חזק קברם אלינו. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה בני ישראל לכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נדר בקודש
נורא תהילות אוסף אלה מלכותך ראו בניך בוקי הים לפני משה, זה עליינו ואמרו
אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד.
ונאמר, כי פדה אדוני את יעקב, וגייסו מיד חזק ממנו. ברוך אתה אדוני, גל ישראל. אשכיבנו ונראים עם שלום. תקנין באיזה טוב מלפניך. ושמוצאתנו בואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם. ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך. ברוך אתה אדוני. הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל. הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל.
Amen. Please rise. Adonai Moshe Moedena El Bnei Yisrael.
Adonai Moshe את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל.
Friends, the Chatzik Chalash on page 34 is followed by the Silent Amidah for this evening of Shavuot, beginning on page 41 in your Sidurim.
יקרא ויקדש שמי רבה, ויאמר דברה חירותי וימליך מלכותי בחייכון וביומכון ובחיי לכל בית ישראל, בגלה וזמן קריב ויאמרו
Amen.
אמן.
Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevorach, Lo Yiparach.
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו לעילה מנקו בכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה תמירם ביומה ויאמרו אמן.
Page 41.
יתגדל ויקדש מרבה וילמד וברחרתי ויאמר בחותי וחי יכול ויאמר יכול וחי את בית ישראל בגלה וזמן קריב אמרו אמן יהי שמי רבה מברך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי קודשה בריחו Leil min kol khata v'shirata tushkhata v'rachmata amiram b'yamav v'imru amen titkabel tzloton v'aton v'ho Yisrael kodem avonu v'shmaya v'imru amen yesh lamarav v'shmaya v'chaim aleinu v'ko Yisrael v'imru amen Oseh shalom b'imromav v'yoseh shalom aleinu v'ko Yisrael v'imru amen.
Page 50, the Kiddush in honor of Shavuot.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri agafen Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'am ורוממנו מכל לשון וגירשנו במצוותיו ותיתן לנו אלינו באהבה מועדים לשמחה חגים וזמנים לששון את יום חג השבועות הזה זמן מתן תורתנו מקרא קודש זכר ליציאת מצרים כיוונו ובחרת ואותנו קידשת מכל עמים ומדעי קודשך בשמחה וששון הנחלתנו ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש ישראל והזמנים
Amen.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
Amen. Friends, please remain standing as the Chazan leads us in Aleinu, page 51.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת קדושה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו גויי ארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות לאדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגאון עלינו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים משתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא.
שנות שמיים ויוסר הארץ ומשה ויגע בשמיים ועל שכינות עזב וגבי מרבים אלוהינו אינו הכתוב בדרך על כן נקבל אחד
הקדושתך אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו
Mourners Kaddish on 52. Yit Gadal, V'yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah,
Amen.
V'yolma Divarachi Rutei, V'yamlich Malchutei, V'chayechon U'v'yomechon U'v'chayei Dechol Beit Yisrael, V'agola U'v'izman Kor'i V'yamaru Amen, Yehei Shemei Rabbah Mevorach, V'yolam Olomei Olmaya, Yitbarach, V'yishtabach, V'yitpo'ar, V'yitramam, V'yitnaseh, V'yitadar, V'yitaleh, V'yitalal, Shmei Dekudsha, Brichu, La'ela, Mein Kol, Birchata, V'shirata, Tushbechata, V'nechemata, Damiran, Be'olma, V'yimaru Amen. Yehei Shlama, Rabba, Minshmaya, V'chayim Aleinu, V'yal Kol Yisrael, V'yimaru Amen. Oseh Shalom Imrav, V'yaseh Shalom. Aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael, Imaru, Amen. Friends, you'll all please be seated, but not for too long, as we're going to just review the schedule for the rest of the evening. We're going to have a short Shavuot We have Shavuot refreshments in the upper lobby. Let's take maybe 10, 15 minutes or so, chance to greet each other, take some cheesecake, take some cookies, take some cheesecake and cookies, and have a little something, and then we'll meet back inside here in about 10 minutes or so, as we will begin the next session led by Cantor Weiss. If everyone make their way into the upper lobby at this time. But remember, not down the steps to the parking lot, just to the upper lobby where the food is, okay? Again, please plan to be with us and stay and enjoy as we have other Cantor, myself, and Sammy Vingran on the schedule for tonight.
Those of us who are joining in live stream at home, this is a message to you that I'll be using the Siddur Sim Shalom as part of my lecture. So if at home you have a copy of that book, now would be a time to prepare it for you. As you find your place in the sanctuary, try to sit where you have a siddur in front of you. And again, those of you in home, if you can find this Sim Shalom siddur or another siddur, that would be helpful. Okay, people in the lobby, we're now going to have a drawing for the door prize, but you have to be present in the sanctuary in order to be eligible. Okay, here we go. Tomorrow, first day of Shavuot, a unique liturgical poem is chanted in Ashkenazi synagogues all over the world. This poem, which you find on page 222, that's your cue to look at page 222, runs from page 222 through 225, begins with the phrase Agdamut Milin, meaning words of introduction, referring introduction to the Torah reading, so that this poem is read right before the Torah reading. This poem, Agdamut, is special in several respects. It's quite lengthy compared to other poetry in the Siddur. Each verse comprises 2 lines, and each line ends on the same syllable, ta. Ta. Also, the poet uses alphabetical acrostics in the first letter of the first word of each line in 3 different ways. On the first 2 pages, page 222, 223, he doubles the entire alphabet in each pair of lines. Then, starting at the top of page 224, the first letters of the first words spell out his name, Meir, son of Rabbi Yitzchak. And then from the middle of that page, the initial letters spell out a brief invocation or brief wish, saying, may his learning, referring to himself, may his learning and good deeds increase. In Hebrew, Yigadel b'Torah uv'ma'asim tovim, Amen, Chazak ve'ematz. The very simple and even monotonous ta rhyme scheme that runs throughout the Agdamut, however, is applied to a complex vocabulary of vivid and beautiful imagery that hardly comes through, unfortunately, in an English translation, especially not in the truncated English translation of the Siddur that we have. There's a richness of midrashic and mystical references to God, to the Torah, to the Jewish people, and to the world to come in this poem. Finally, Agdamut is also distinct in that it is written entirely in the language of Aramaic. Long after Aramaic had ceased to be spoken and written by Jews during the 1,000 years from the time of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, running through early antiquity, this language was favored in medieval Europe and elsewhere among writers of Jewish mystical works, including the work in question now, the Agdamut poem, as well as the famous book of the Zohar. It may surprise some of us that the traditional Siddur would contain a language other than the classical Jewish language of Hebrew. But actually, Hebrew is not the only classical Jewish language. Taking the Bible as a handy barometer to what is classically Jewish, we find that several chapters in books of Daniel and Ezra are written in Aramaic. The book of Jeremiah has one Aramaic sentence, and even in the Chumash, in the book of Genesis, we find Lavan translating Jacob's words, Gal Eid, which mean a heap that will be a witness to us. He translates Jacob's Hebrew term into his own Aramaic equivalent, Yagar Sahaduta. That's in the Parsha Vayetze. So we have 2 Aramaic words in the book of Genesis. And In later classical Jewish works, of course, Aramaic appears more than in fragments. The Palestinian and Babylonian Talmuds, both massive works, are but two of the major Jewish works produced in Aramaic. Very important also are the two major Aramaic translations of the Bible called Targumim, Targum Onkelos and Targum Yonatan. Incidentally, this gives us the Yiddish term for Aramaic, Targum Lashon, or the language of the Targum. Aside from the classical Jewish texts, Aramaic was an international language, not just Jewish, an international language that was the vernacular of the preeminent Jewish community in Babylonia. But even in the land of Israel, the Hebrew language was gradually replaced by Aramaic in everyday use under the influence of the exiles returning from Babylonia. Part of the reason for the easy interchange between the two languages is that both Hebrew and Aramaic are Semitic languages that share many elements of vocabulary and grammar. They were easily written in the same alphabet and spelling system. Unlike Yiddish, which uses the Hebrew alphabet but interprets that alphabet according to its own system, Aramaic words are read today exactly as if they were Hebrew. So when you come across an Aramaic prayer in the Siddur, you may not even know that it's Aramaic. Well, after tonight you will. But indeed, Hebrew writing in general, as we know it today, which includes the script in a Torah scroll, is based on one particular form of the classic Aramaic alphabet. Now we jump ahead to the 21st century. Among the first words uttered today by an Israeli child are Ima and Abba. These are two Aramaic words that entered the Hebrew language a very long time ago, coexisting with the Hebrew versions Em, Ima, Em, and Av, Abba. Before the creation of the State of Israel, there were small pockets of Jews in Kurdistan, Iraq, and Iran who spoke Aramaic. In fact, in my own congregation in Baltimore, there was a member whose family spoke Aramaic. He knew a few words here and there, so this wasn't just theoretical. But if you live in the United States today and want your kid to actually learn to speak Aramaic, one of the only places to do so, or only way to do so, would be in the kindergarten of, guess where? The Syriac Orthodox Church, located on West Midland Avenue in Paramus. It happens to be one of the very few places in all of the United States that teaches Aramaic, especially in kindergarten level. This way they prepare their children to sing and read their own Christian scriptures, which are written in Aramaic. Now, let's briefly survey the role of Aramaic in today's Jewish life. The name of the early part of every morning service, consisting mainly of various psalms, the word psalm is the Greek word for song. This section is called Pesuke de Zimra. In this phrase, the word Pesuke, meaning verses, is the same in Hebrew and in Aramaic, while the word de Zimra, meaning of song, is strictly an Aramaic word. The Hebrew equivalent to de Zimra would be Hazamirot, or Shel Hazamirot. But because the term Pesuke de Zimra was coined in the Talmud, the entire phrase should be considered an Aramaic one. By the way, the final aleph in de Zimra, like the final aleph in the words Ima and Abba, are common signs of Aramaic, which you will find within
a Hebrew context using the Hebrew alphabet. So that'll be one clue. If you see a passage with a lot of final alepphs, that'll be a sign. And also, the first dalet of de Zimra, which is a prefix meaning of, shell in Hebrew, is also an Aramaic hallmark. To give you a taste of basic Aramaic now, following are some more Aramaic and Hebrew pairs from the simpler vocabulary of the prayer Berich Shemay. Now, this is your signal to take out your, oh, you already have your Siddur. Folks at home, you have your Siddur? And turn to page 139. We're going to draw from the simpler vocabulary of the prayer Berich Shemay, which is a prayer, an entire Aramaic prayer drawn from the book of Zohar that we mentioned earlier. It's at the bottom of page 139. The first word, Berich, sounds like which Hebrew word? Baruch. And that's what it means, blessed. The fourth word, Alma, sounds like which Hebrew word? Olam. And it means world or universe. Right below the word Alma, you have Le'alam, which sounds exactly like Le'olam, meaning forever. Below that word Le'alam, you have the little word Lana. I didn't mean to single you out, Lana. But the word Lana, what do you think is the equivalent of which Hebrew word? Lanu, meaning us, or to us. The first word of the next, meaning the fourth line, the first word of that line is Berachamin, meaning with compassion. You may know the word Rachamim, but that final nun illustrates an Aramaic plural which is formed with a final nun corresponding to a Hebrew plural in words formed with plural words formed with a final mem. Now hang on and let's try the next three-word phrase, which is a little more complex. The next three words means, may it be thy will. Now, Yehei is easy. It's like Yehi, to be, like Lu Yehi, let it be. Let it be. Ra'ava. Ra'ava is hard to pin down. Let's work on Ra'ava. Do you know the Hebrew word for an idea or a thought? Rayon. Rayon is a word for an idea. Now, the word idea is like the word thought or disposition, and you can see how disposition can then mean a positive disposition. So the word rayon, which sounds like ra'ava, in Aramaic, ra'ava means will, your disposition or a positive will, or may it be the will. Kadamach means before you. Now what's the connection? Kadam in Hebrew sounds like kodem, before, or kedem, as in years before. So that is the equivalent of lifnei in Hebrew, before, or lefanecha, or milfanecha. So kodamach is the equivalent of milfanecha. So Yehi Ra'ava Kodamach means Yehi Ratzon Milfanecha. May it be thy will. We skip the next word and find the short word lan, which is merely a shorter form of the same word lana we had before. And the final nun in chayin, again, corresponds to the Hebrew final mem, making it equivalent of chaim, life. We turn the page, and we're on page 140, and we pick out some of the words now that we sing out loud in our services. Starting with Bay, is the equivalent of Hebrew bo, in him. Bo, be, him. Ana is like ani, I. Rachitz, it's hard to guess, means desire. So be ana rachitz means in him is my desire, or I desire God. Okay? And then it goes on, Velishmei kadisha yakira. Shmei, like you had before, berich shmei. I didn't point it out, but shmei is like, which Hebrew word? Shem, name. Kadisha, pretty easy, is like holy, kadosh. So lishmei kadisha, holy name. Yakira sounds like Hebrew yakar, meaning precious. So, in him and in his precious holy name, Ana, Amar, Tush Bechan. Ana, we already know, means I. Amar sounds like Omer. I, present tense, I say, speak. Tush Bechan is very similar to Tishbachot or Shevachot, which means praises. And so this means, to his holy, precious name, I say praises. Now, by the way, what makes a prayer like this comes from the Zohar easier to see the Hebrew parallels than many other Aramaic texts is because the writer or writers of the Zohar principally thought in Hebrew and were familiar with the Hebrew Siddur, so they composed Aramaic works heavily indebted to Hebrew. So this Aramaic mystical prayer, Brich Shemei, just like the Akdamut written a couple of centuries before the Zohar, reflects the continuing use of the language for special purposes like religious poetry and magical formulas. For example, the 16th century Sephardi Kabbalists moved to the Galilean region of Israel, which was once a living center of the Aramaic language and Aramaic usage. And so it was more natural to them to shift to using Aramaic in that environment. We find one popular example of the Kabbalists' work on page 317. We'll quickly flip to that. Page 317 is one of several Shabbat table songs that were composed in Aramaic, some of them in the land of, in the city of Tzfat, others later in other areas. And these Aramaic table songs are sung today by Jews all over the world. So it's not just ancient history, it's common practice today. Any questions thus far on what we've covered? Yes, Dinah. Dinah? Dinah?
Since you mentioned that there are Aramaic words already in the Tanakh, which came first, Hebrew or Aramaic, or did they develop at the same time?
The sister languages. Yeah. Right. Yeah, and Lana, you had a question? Same question? Okay. Now, let's survey some of the Aramaic texts in our liturgy and other areas of Jewish life. First, a trivia quiz. Consider this your first trivia question of the night. Quickly, turn to page 119. 119. And find me the one Aramaic word on that page. Found it, Rabbi Cohen? That's right. It's easy, it's actually on the first line. So if you're already on lines 2, 3, and 4, you missed it. So Purkan is an Aramaic word with a Hebrew prefix, ha Purkan. And Purkan is merely an Aramaic synonym for the other words for salvation and redemption, and that's what Purkan means, salvation and redemption. This noun, Purkan, brings us to our next category of Aramaic prayers, which is vernacular prayers in the Siddur. What do I mean by vernacular prayers in the Siddur? The equivalent of an English prayer in the Siddur. In other words, having a prayer on the Hebrew side meant to be readily and easily understood by everybody in the congregation. And the example of that, so just like English today, Aramaic was the preferred language when it was important that the words be understood by all. So, if you turn to page 149, we have the perfect example of this kind of vernacular prayer. Why don't you look at the English translation of the Yikum Purkan, and you'll realize 148. Sorry. 148. You'll realize that the text is not like a prayer which is a praising God or a historical prayer or something commemorating a holiday. Rather, what is it? It's like a mishaberach. It's a prayer for the welfare of a certain people. And what people? It's actually the people in Babylon who was, while there were Aramaic speakers in the land of Israel, these Aramaic speakers looked to the land of Babylon, or today Iraq, as their homeland as far as their linguistic homeland, where Aramaic was the natural vernacular. So we still recite the Aramaic vernacular prayer, Yikum Purkan, in the precise area of the service which is characterized today by several other English readings. So we read this in Aramaic, for old time's sake. Another important Aramaic prayer is the Kaddish. In early antiquity, when Aramaic ruled, early antiquity is means at the beginning of the Common Era. It was common for lectures, that is, Talmudic lectures, biblical lectures, and sermons to end with a prayer, and the public response to that prayer containing the Aramaic phrase from the book of Daniel. That phrase is, "May the name of God be blessed from everlasting to everlasting." This custom is still alive today as the Kaddish, that means the custom of saying a prayer after a learning session, is still alive today in the form of the Kaddish D'Rabbanan, which was recited after a public Torah study session. The response by the audience or the congregation, Yehei Shemei Rabbah Mevarach, became the central element in various forms of Kaddish prayer that eventually traveled from the study hall to the synagogue. And that's how we have, and the Kaddish has a long and rich history, which I'm not going to go into now, but just want to point out that another sign of the popular character of the Kaddish is its simple, straightforward prose style. It's not poetry at all. It's a very plain, simple, almost drab language no fancy metaphors, even though the ideas are lofty, praising God. So now, interestingly enough, however, as a result of the extreme popularity of the Kaddish over a wide area of Jewish geography, there have been various forms of the Kaddish. That is, besides the basic genres of the Kaddish, there are variations, geographical variations of the Kaddish, and the language of the Kaddish is not pure Aramaic, but contains an admixture of Hebrew as well. You can see, for example, that the final line of the Kaddish that you're familiar with, the Murns Kaddish, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, is taken from where? Where does that verse come from? It's the end of the Amidah. That sentence, it's a Hebrew, it's Hebrew, and it's the Hebrew equivalent of the preceding Aramaic line, Yehei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chaim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael. So you see a kind of simultaneous translation within the Kaddish, juggling between Aramaic and Hebrew. Let's go to page 306. 306. On page 306, you will find a brief ritual, not a prayer per se, a ritual that accompanies the preparing of an Eruv Tafshilin. An Eruv Tafshilin is a technical means for enabling one to cook on a festival for the Sabbath, as is the case this year, tomorrow. To enable one to cook tomorrow for Saturday, one needs to have made an Eruv Tafshilin today. And the text of the ritual is a blessing in Hebrew, simple blessing, a typical bracha in Hebrew, and followed by a declaration in Aramaic. This is because whenever a religious ceremony had attached to it a declaration that needed to be fully understood by the speaker for legal reasons, the rabbi stipulated that it should be said in Aramaic. Such is the case also, for instance, with the declaration Kol Chamira, which is found in a typical Haggadah. This Kol Chamira, all Chametz, is the Aramaic for Kol Chametz, which that accompanies the ceremony of the burning of Chametz. In Eastern Europe, these declarations, these Aramaic declarations, were often said in Yiddish, because that was the language easily understood. And Aramaic was Greek to them, so to speak. Our Siddur Sim Shalom has the Erev Tafshilin formula translated into Hebrew, along with the English translation. But most Americans should really recite it in English. Perhaps the most famous example of this category of Aramaic in Jewish life today is what? Which liturgical work is the most famous example of Aramaic? No? Don't raise your hands all at once now. I'll give you a hint.
More famous than some of what you've already talked about?
Yeah. More famous to people who don't come to shul regularly. That should give you a hint. Kol Nidre, right. That's the answer. Okay. Perhaps the most famous example of this category of Aramaic in Jewish life today is Kol Nidre, which is actually not a prayer. It's a legal formula, similar in some ways to the Erev Tafshilin, or the annulling of one's chametz. But instead of annulling chametz, the Kol Nidre is meant to annul any inappropriate or unwitting religious vows we might make in the year to come. This iconic text went through many historical twists and turns because the rabbis were never quite comfortable with the implication of such a blanket release of vows. But Jews everywhere insisted on hanging on to their dear Kol Nidre, and so the rabbis kind of tried to make it legally work by changing the tenses of past to present to future and stuff like that. Jews everywhere insisted on hanging on to their dear Kol Nidre, and over the centuries, many Jews paid for its popularity at the hand of anti-Semites who misused it as supposed evidence of Jewish faithlessness. So in the long run, it would have been better for those Jews to stop saying Kol Nidre. While a more logical time for the annual recitation of an annulment formula might have been on or before Rosh Hashanah, the more emotional time of Yom Kippur became traditional. Also, many individual and collective emotions recalled by persecutions of various Jewish communities eventually transformed a religious technical formula into a deeply felt a prayerful moment. The final transformation from formula to prayer for Ashkenazi communities came in the 17th century, when a stirring melody that we all know became firmly attached to the simple words. There was no getting rid of it from that point on. Even in Reform congregations, it hung on. Among most Sephardim, however, Kol Nidre is still recited very plainly today, as befits the simple language of what it is. Having just mentioned the Haggadah in connection with Kol Chamira, let's peek into other pages of the Haggadah and see what else we can find. Following the Kiddush, an ancient Aramaic invocation opens the Haggadah ritual proper. Ha lachma anya, right? Behold the bread of poverty. Lachma is like Hebrew lechem. The invocation says, all who are hungry, come join us in the Passover sacrifice celebration. So this invitation was meant to be clearly understood by travelers in Jerusalem coming to the temple for the sacrifice, whose mother tongue was Aramaic. They were inviting the travelers, so they were inviting them in the language they would understand. At the other end of the Haggadah, we have Chad Gadya, a song which, although most of it is in Aramaic, there's some Hebrew in it too. The Chad Gadya, believe it or not, may have originally been written in Yiddish. It appears in that language, in Yiddish, in the first Haggadah printed by a Jew, which was printed in Prague in 1526. And in that Haggadah, the Chad Gadya is in Yiddish, not in Aramaic at all. There are other editions, later editions, where Chad Gadya is in one or more languages, but there it was only in Yiddish. The song was eventually translated into other Jewish languages like Judeo-Arabic and Ladino, and strangely enough, into Aramaic. Here we may have a case where Aramaic was chosen not for its status as vernacular, but quite the opposite, in order to lend mystery and seriousness to a simple folk song. In this way, the Hebrew Haggadah would be bookended at the very beginning and very end by the special Jewish language of Aramaic. And I'll just toss out this little teaser. Aramaic is also important in life cycles of weddings and divorces. In everybody's wedding, every Jewish person's wedding, and very few, we hope, Jewish people's divorces, the language Aramaic plays a key role, because the documents have to, the ketubah is in Aramaic, and the get is also in Aramaic. That's all. Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Now I have a perfect rejoinder for those who want more English in the service. I would say I would, but then I'd have to remove some of the Aramaic favorites, which of course are probably added in for the same reason. Friends, for my next section, Jewish law and artificial intelligence, I'm going to be passing out these source sheets, which you may find, which I hope you'll find interesting, or if not, give you something to read. Well, give you something to read while I'm doing my thing. First, once again, I want to thank Razy and the Chazan for their wonderful sessions this evening. And again, I'll be teaching now in our final lecture, our final segment of the Tikkun Leil Shavuot will be our rabbinic intern, Sami Vingran, teaching after me. We want to thank you all for being with us, those who are here in the sanctuary, and those who are with us on live stream. We're grateful for you. So we've all been hearing a lot about artificial intelligence lately. Have we not? If you haven't been hearing about it recently, I would like to invite you to get out of your homes and get out just a little bit more. What is artificial intelligence? Does anybody know what it is? All right. Working definition. The theory and development of computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence, such as visual perception, speech recognition, decision making, and translation between languages. Or another good working definition is a branch of computer science dealing with the simulation of intelligent behavior in computers. Those are our working definitions for this evening, okay? Artificial intelligence involves using computer algorithms. So for all you people who are in 11th grade studying advanced algebra, wondering what are you ever going to use this for? Now you know. So artificial intelligence uses computer algorithms to arrive at conclusions, such as medical decisions sometimes. We're going to use that. I'm mentioning that because that's one example we're going to talk about tonight in many different areas. But for example, for medical decisions, often without human input. Artificial intelligence may enhance or limit doctors by decision-making predictions and even diagnoses. Indeed, for those of you who are reading some of the analysis of Israel's recent conflict with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, it was revealed that many of the targets that Israel selected were generated by their complex algorithms, that is, artificial intelligence. For those of you who in the financial world, artificial intelligence is used extensively in the world of finance as well. It's all over the place. How many of you talk to your phones? I do all the time. When my phone talks back to me, No, serious. But I extensively use the voice recognition software on my phone. I haven't texted with my fingers in years. It's all over the place. It is using these complex algorithms to simulate intelligent, that is to say, human behavior. Let's go back into ancient history, okay? Ancient history. 1997, okay? The world got a very rude awakening to artificial intelligence. Anybody remember what that event was? Anybody remember Deep Blue? What was Deep Blue? Okay, 1997, that's correct, Lana. IBM developed a chess-playing program, Deep Blue, which took on and beat the reigning world chess master, Garry Kasparov. Remember that? And what happened? Again, a long time ago. You know, there was 1997, and then there was the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Really, ancient history in terms of the world of computing. The principles of chess were programmed into the computer, which masterfully won the match against Kasparov. Anybody know how the computer beat Kasparov? Well, kind of yes and kind of no. So, but more yes than no. The computer basically searched through millions of possible chess moves every time Kasparov, moved, rook to queen's 9 or whatever. I haven't played chess in a long time, right? So it really could sift through millions of possible moves. And it worked out very well. Now fast forward 2 decades later to about 2017 or 2018. Okay? Google, which wasn't even around in 1997, had a artificial intelligence subsidiary named DeepMind. I don't know if DeepMind was based on Deep Blue. I don't remember. But DeepMind, this AI subsidiary of Google, devised AlphaZero. Okay? Anybody remember AlphaZero? Which was a machine learning algorithm. Okay? They also decided to do their own version of Deep Blue. Without any human input, aside from the basic rules of chess, AlphaZero beat the world's best chess-playing computer program after continuously playing chess against itself for just 4 hours. Okay? So imagine, between 1997 and 2017, a lot of people improved upon the original Deep Blue. Okay? And then came AlphaZero that blew all the previous programs out of the water. Again, and all they did was program the basic rules of chess into the program. And again, as I said, it just played against itself for just 4 hours. In those 4 hours, it played millions of times. And here's the chiddush, as we say in Hebrew. Here's the new thing, which is, I think, what Rabbi Kogan was alluding to. it learned from its mistakes. You understand? Like a human being theoretically learns from its mistakes. Say theoretically because we're not machines. We're supposed to learn from our mistakes. But theoretically, machines aren't supposed to learn from their mistakes. They're supposed to do what human inventors or human programmers program them to do, and that's kind of it. But this was different. For the first time, we have a program that literally gets better on its own over time. How much time? 4 hours. And AlphaZero is currently regarded as the best chess player in the world. Human or computer. And when playing, it actually displays evidence of insight, which is another dimension of artificial intelligence. Frightened? Nowadays, artificial intelligence not just acquires knowledge, and this is the thing that we've been dealing with over the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, it has the potential to arrive at conclusions on its own. Everyone understand? Let's say it surpasses what the human beings who have worked on this and who have programmed this could have actually imagined at the outset. Okay? Translation. Now, there's actual learning going on. That is to say, artificial intelligence is capable of learning under certain conditions on its own. Okay? It's part of our world today. I mentioned voice-activated software, only because it's my favorite. How many of you have heard of GPD? Okay? I know of colleagues who have written sermons and dared their congregants to figure out, literally, is it live or is it Memorex, as they say? Okay? For those of you old enough to get the reference. Did the rabbi really write it, or was it generated from this artificial intelligence program? And one colleague said to me, his congregant said, how do we chat GTB? Because it's much better than anything you have ever come up with in the 24 years you've served our congregation. I am told, again, as you all know, I'm a doctor, but I'm not a real doctor. But I am told that AI is being used in medical procedures on a very regular basis that all of you are familiar with. And by the way, we have real doctors here today, so you could ask them at the next time we pop in for cheesecake and cookies. I'm told, for example, that AI is better than the best radiologists in spotting lesions on mammograms. Any of the doctors have heard of this or can attest to that it's being used? And according to certain docs I consult with, it's better than the best radiologists. There are AI systems that are being developed to help diagnose whether one will develop Alzheimer's or other diseases later in life. A doctor may know how to interpret X-rays and be well versed in the most current research, but computers have access to far more data, and therefore can conceivably arrive at more precise conclusions. Again, this isn't going on in a galaxy far, far away at the end of the 23rd century, for those who get that reference, okay? And for those who do get the reference, please explain it to the cantor who doesn't get my Star Trek references. not once in 26 years. But this is going on right now at the dawn of the 21st century. So now the question, what does this mean for the Jews? What are the implications of this exciting and potentially dangerous technology for halakha, for the observance of Jewish law? Okay? Before we begin, any questions or anything like that? And for those who got the Star Trek reference, thank you very much. Okay? Any questions so far? Does anybody want to take issue of any of the introduction or the examples from artificial intelligence? Okay. So what are the questions that we need to ask ourselves? One, there are a variety of them, but let's start with this one. Can we use artificial intelligence to assist us in the performance of mitzvot? Human beings, Jews, who are human beings, have the obligation for mitzvot, right? How can artificial intelligence be used or incorporated into our observance of mitzvot? Not asking should it yet, but can it be? Howard, do you have a question? Absolutely. So again, in case not everybody heard, Howard was also picking up on what I asked and to correct myself. Can we and or should we employ this exciting new technology in our observance of mitzvot? So I want to begin, and by the way, having raised that question, consider what the traditional sources. Hold on. Well, I seem to be missing. Oh, here it is. The artificial intelligence. I don't know about its implications for halakha, but maybe it'll help me keep my sermon pages in order. My notes when I'm actually talking from the bima. So one of the first areas where that I'm aware of, where this was considered, is in the world of kashrut. Okay? How many of you are familiar with the basics of shchita, kosher slaughter? The very basics. Okay? When an animal is properly slaughtered, that's the first and most important, but only one of several steps that are involved in the processing of kosher meat. Okay? It all begins with the proper slaughter of the animal. But then afterwards, according to halakha, certain parts of the animal have to be removed by a person with great skill. We have three major items that need to be removed from an animal once it's been slaughtered. Okay, everybody with me so far? Some of you are familiar what's known as the the sciatic nerve, which needs to be removed from the animal after the proper slaughter. Okay, there's something that needs to be removed called chalev, some of the prohibited fatty parts of the animal, and there's something known as nikor acharayim, which is the removal of certain large blood vessels from the animal as well. Okay? Some of you may be familiar with some of these, especially regarding the removal of sciatic nerve. Okay? So the question is that assuming for a second that the actual slaughter must be done by a human being, which we'll get to in a moment, can a robot that's programmed possibly conduct these acts after a proper shchita, proper slaughter of the animal has taken place? Okay? Remember, have to have a proper slaughter, and then these three items, chelev, the gid hanasheh, and the nikur acharayim, can that be done by a robot or mechanical means that has been programmed to do that particular act? And before you say, well, that's crazy, right? There are surgeries in the United States of America, there are whole areas of surgeries that the majority of that type of surgery is done, I guess the term is robotically, right? Indeed, there are people in the congregation who have had different types of surgeries that were done robotically. And again, I'm not a real doctor. I only play one when it suits my interest. But I understand there are, in many ways, significant advantages, right? Which, of course, I'm not the one to talk with you about, but there's a reason why the vast majority of certain types of surgery are done in that particular manner. So the question is, can a robot do these actions afterwards? Do you understand the question? Anybody want to give a thought? Yes, they can. No, they can't.
I would say they can, but may they be? That's up to the rabbis.
Well, it's certainly okay. As halakha questions ought to be determined by rabbis, but again, the more complicated the area of halakha, the more training that rabbis need to be, both in the area of Jewish law as well as the science that accompanies it. Okay? I asked this question because some years ago this was asked of a guy named Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Rimon, who's the head of the Jerusalem College of Technology, okay, which is one of those places in Israel that is devoted to not only halachic rigor, but these cutting-edge questions. He's probably among the rabbis in the world most qualified to answer this type of question. What was his answer? Yes, it's okay. No, it's not okay. What do you think? If you think that there might be something to it, raise your hand. If you think no way, raise your hand. I'm sorry, even the vegetarians, you got to answer. It doesn't mean you have to eat the meat if you're wrong, okay? Yes, it's okay. No, it's not okay. Raise your hands for yes. Raise your hands for no. Raise your hand for yes. He says that if the slaughter has been done properly, then robots can actually do that. Because there is no kavanah, there's no specific act of religious thought that's associated with them, which is different than the actual slaughter itself. Now, why is it that perhaps a robot could do the removal of those special parts after the shkita, after the slaughter, but not the slaughter itself? Let's go to the source sheet. Okay? Okay. Shulchan Aruch, from the Code of Jewish Law, Yoredeya, the second section, which specifically deals with the question of kashrut. Okay? Ayu Yisrael Fosel Ufasul Ochazim Besakim Shoktim Besula. If a Jew who is fit to do the act of shchita, and one who is not qualified or ought not be doing the slaughtering for a variety of reasons, do the slaughter simultaneously. The question is it a kosher slaughter? And the answer is no. Okay? If a person who is fit to do it works literally at the same time with the one who is not permitted to do it, the product that they slaughter together is not fit for consumption. All right? It's disallowed. The idea being that only one who is fit for that sacred task, only his slaughter, the animal that he slaughters will be fit for consumption. I mean, that's something special about the person, that he's fit, literally, who's fit by Jewish law to engage in this task. And it's the idea of kavanah, religious intensity, and being one who is knowledgeable and is an observant person himself, who is fit to do this work. Okay? Now, let's go down to the second one, which has to do with whether or not you can use mechanical means or non-human means in the actual slaughter of the animal. Okay? Again, we're just trying to find a source that might be on some level analogous to something like the machines that we have today that might be able to do this type of work. Okay? We'll go into the English part just to save a little bit of time. A person may set a knife on a wheel of stone or wood that rotates by one's hand or foot and proceed to the neck of the animal or fowl until it is slaughtered by turning the wheel. And that would be acceptable. Meaning, a person built a contraption, but a human being is controlling the contraption, and that contraption is capable of making a proper cut of the neck of the animal for the purpose of Jewish shchita. Everybody with me so far? But the idea that a human being is controlling the process, and therefore it would be considered kosher shchita, kosher slaughter. Everybody with me so far? The human element is overseeing it, okay? Is very much a part of it. The machine is working with, not for, but with the human that's controlling it, okay? And if water rotates the wheel and he places the neck of the animal opposite it while it is turning, causing it to be slaughtered, it is unacceptable. Let's say it is not considered kosher slaughter. Why? Because a force other than a human being is controlling the process. Does that make sense to everybody? The difference between the two cases? And an exemption is made if a person caused the water to flow until they turn the wheel and cause it to slaughter by turning it. However, skipping down, however, a slaughtering that results from a second rotation is unacceptable because the force did not come from the man's power, but from the power of the flowing water. So the rabbi that I mentioned before would say that a kosher slaughtering process without a slaughtering process without some human being in a direct supervisory controlling position would not be acceptable. But after the fact, once the animal has been slaughtered properly, and we are involved in what's called trebor, in the deveining process, that might be acceptable. Howard.
Does the slaughter have to take place by the hands of a Jew?
100%.
Now, if you are arguing about artificial intelligence, unless that machine is Jewish, they cannot do it.
Well, I think you're right, but let's hold on. We're going to get to that. But again, at this point, I'm not sure that we can transfer Jewish status to a machine, no matter how intelligent that machine may think they are.
What I'm saying is that you cannot translate it to a machine.
I suspect you are correct. I suspect you are correct. And then the next question has to do with, there's a lot of halakhic literature that talks about the knife that a shochet, a kosher slaughterer, must use, and especially the method of checking the knife constantly, okay? And the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Torah, which are the sources on the bottom of page 2, talks about how a slaughterer must check the knife, which is known as a chalif in Hebrew, must check the knife at its tip. You hold it upside like this. You check the tip, and you check the sides, and you pass it over your fingers and over your fingernails to test it to make sure it has no nicks or what I'm looking for in Hebrew, nothing that might cause extra suffering to the animal and detract from the ability of the shochet to swiftly cut the animal across its neck. And you have to have great kavanah, great religious intensity, and it has to go, again, you have to literally use your hands to do it. So for that reason, a machine can't do that checking because it specifically calls for the human interaction between the person itself and the knife. Okay. Mark.
I think that's the bottom line here. It has to be done humanely. Current AI is not humane. Future AI might be. The current AI is not.
Okay. So Mark brought the fact that the whole point is to I don't want to paraphrase it, to safeguard the humanity. Can you just say that again? I'm not sure that I understand you correctly. Mark, can you just repeat that? I'm not sure if I understood you correctly.
I'm just saying that to do this humanely, you have to have a human involved.
Oh, I see. Because we want to safeguard to make sure the process is as humane as possible. Perhaps, and I think you may be onto something, but the sources basically call for the judgment and the experience of the shochet, of the slaughterer, in the process. So others have asked, could a laser be checked? Could a laser be used to check the sharpness of the knife? And the answer is, it can be used to perhaps point out defects in the knife before the slaughterer checks it on his own. But the bottom line is that the slaughterer himself, not a machine, is responsible for checking the knife and making sure that it fulfills those halakhic requirements. Everybody so far? One more area, okay? Now, another area of artificial intelligence, and this is something that I'm just not as familiar with, is called Brain-Computer Interface, or BCI. Is anybody familiar with that? Brain-Computer Interface, which enables users to interact with computers via brain activity, or by thinking, okay? Some of you have seen this because in the last 5 or 7 years, there's been advances with people who have, well, let's say, who are paraplegics, where they are doing work where people can literally think and manipulate digits of different types of artificial limbs and things like that. Some of you have seen this. There's been a lot of research of this in the United States. There's been a lot of research about this in Israel. And tremendous advances have been achieved really just the last 5 or 7 years or so. So even 25 years ago, when Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, this was like real science fiction. But now the wiring of brains and computers is actually reality. And there are companies that have invested tens and hundreds of millions of dollars into moving this progress along. It is very, have any of you read these best-selling books by the Israeli futurist Yuval Harris? Yuval Harari? Are you familiar with those? Right. By the way, he's a professor of philosophy at Hebrew University. He's on everybody's genius list. He was even on the Bill Maher show last year. Right? And he's written several bestsellers. And he spoke about the next wave of human development will be the linking of the brain and technology. And others have theorized that it's very likely that our brains might be able to interact with our smartphones and tablets, like we'll be able to turn on an oven or a light switch simply by thinking about it. Or I'll be able to get you to come to synagogue on time just by thinking about it. Yeah, that was funny and you know it, okay? Which leads to another question. Can one theoretically fulfill a mitzvah simply by thinking about it? Right now, can you think of a mitzvah? Can you fulfill a mitzvah simply by thinking about it? Generally not. And conversely, can one be Mechalel Shabbos? Can you violate Shabbat merely by thinking about a forbidden act? You know, my mother-in-law, she should rest in peace, used to say, they can't arrest you for what you're thinking. But l'halacha is what we're thinking all that important. Remember, we are the action people. We're the ones who believe lo hamidrash haikar el hamaseh. It's not the talking that's important, but it's the actual doing of something. You know, there's a famous Shabbat song. It's on page 300 and 320 in your Sidurim. Okay, it's a famous one of the famous mirot for Shabbat. Top of 320. Ma yedidut menuchatech. Okay, some of you know it. It's got a catchy melody. Ma yedidut menuchatech et hashabat hamalkat. Some of you remember that, right? Okay, well, as you go down, there's a wonderful verse. It's 1, 2, 3. It's the last verse on the page. Begin the word chafatzecha. Okay. Chafatzecha bo asurim v'gam lachashov cheshbonot rim mutarim l'shadek habanot v'tikun lomdo sefer l'natzech b'nginot l'got b'imrei shefer b'chol pinot u'machanot. Now again, it's poetry. It's not a halachic work, but It speaks to the things about like what's considered okay on Shabbat and what's not considered okay on Shabbat. And it translates something like, where's my good translation of it? Again, thinking about business, this is the lyric. Thinking about business is forbidden, as is lachshov cheshbonot, as is thinking about your accounts or accounting. Right? But, thinking is permitted, matchmaking is permitted, teaching your children is permitted, singing is permitted, and thinking about lofty things in every corner of the camp. It's a poetic way of saying certain things you shouldn't be thinking about on Shabbat, and other things you should be thinking about on Shabbat. Okay, everybody so far? So kind of a loose translation. But the idea is that it does shed some light on traditional thinking of acceptable and non-acceptable thoughts on Shabbat. So the question for halacha is, if you can think of something and make it happen, is such thought action for the purpose of understanding our obligations on Shabbat? Do you understand the question? If you can think of something and make it happen, literally make it happen, is that action, is that malacha for the purposes of Shabbat? Everybody understand the question? So what's the answer? Well, famous rabbi in Israel who died several years ago, considered one of the leading halachic scholars in the Orthodox world, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, said that theoretically such thought is action, and therefore it's asur, it's forbidden on Shabbat. That is to say, in a time when you might be able to think of something, if BCI takes a hold of us or we get involved with it, and you can think and make things happen, then the very thought has to be asur. But that other rabbi who I mentioned, Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Rimon, again, who's probably one of the current world experts in this area of the interface of science and technology and halakha, said, well, in general cases, it's probably asur, forbidden. But it may indeed be acceptable for certain individuals with unique needs, like a person who is paralyzed, who can think about moving his limbs and then be able to move his limbs and have mobility on Shabbat that he wouldn't have otherwise. He's saying there we have room for flexibility. There's a lot more I could say about the issue, but I do want to stick to our timeline for the evening. I hope one day we'll have an opportunity to talk about the last thing I want to talk about today, which has to do with the idea of the self-driving car and the idea of liability, which is something that insurance companies are dealing with, the federal government is dealing with, and has tremendous halachic implications as well. You're driving a car and you get into an accident, you're liable. Who is liable according to halacha if a self-driving car is involved with an accident? And that's not just a theoretical case. Again, I'm not making a larger statement about self-driving cars, but some of you are aware that there have been more than a handful of deaths that have been associated with self-driving cars, the test drivers, as well as people who've been involved in accidents with self-driving cars. And the question has to do with where AI is such a feature of the technology of these self-driving cars. Is it who ultimately is liable for the damage that an accident might cause, or especially, God forbid, if it causes loss of life? So I called this class not just Halakha and AI, but the new frontier. Because it is a new frontier. AI we're only at the very beginning of it. And if you think about the scientific advances that have been made over the last 100 years, we can only imagine what the next 100 years might bring. And I am confident that as the technology progresses and we integrate more of this into our lives, willing or not, ready or not, that there'll be great halakhic questions. And may God bless us with great halakhic minds who can answer them for us. Until then, I'll do my best. Thank you for coming out and thank you for listening this evening. Friends, and now we're going to invite everybody to take a 5 or 10 minute break. Please, if you'd like to take a little bit of refreshments, and then we're going to invite everybody back for our final session, which will be led by our rabbinic intern, Sami Vingran. What does it mean that we all stood together at Mount Sinai? You can, no, I'd like you to study them. It'll all be on the final, okay? folks, for the last section, we're going to call upon our rabbinic intern, Sammy Vingron. We appreciate everything that Sammy's done for us this past year. I'm very happy that Sammy will be back with us next year again. Without further ado, what really happened at Mount Sinai?
Chag Sameach. Who remembers having been at Sinai? Who remembers what happened at Sinai? Raise your hands if you remember what happened at Sinai, please. Raise your hands if you remember that there was something about the mountain at Sinai. Something about the people. So we have those sorts of memories of Sinai. And what I'm trying to show to you, after I hopefully understood it when my teacher, Professor Benjamin Summer, explained most of those things to me at JTS in New York, is that even though, according to Jewish belief, all Jews remember having stood at Mount Sinai, what it really means varies a lot and is pretty much up to interpretation, as so often in Judaism. And so the first question is, who stood at Sinai? And we just got different answers to my question of, do you remember having been at Sinai? So let's delve directly into the 5th book of Moses, Devarim, or Deuteronomy 29, where it says, "You stand this day, all of you, before your God Adonai, your tribal heads, your elders and your officials, every householder in Israel, your children, your wives, even the stranger within your camp, from the wood chopper to the water drawer, to enter into the covenant of your God Adonai, which your God Adonai is concluding with you this day, with its sanctions, in order to establish you this day as God's people, and in order to be your God, as promised you, and as sworn to your fathers Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. I make this covenant with the sanctions, not with you alone, but with those who are standing here with us this day before our God Adonai, and with those who are not with us here this day." So, if it's okay, I would like to ask you to help me to point out the groups that are mentioned here who were present at Sinai. So, who's mentioned here? So for example, we have the officials and the elders and the tribal heads and every householder in Israel and the children. And we have the wives and the stranger and so on and so on and so on. And basically, in other words, we have all the Jews, or all the Israelites. But we also have the non-Jews. And we would later have different great rabbis who would say that a person who converted to Judaism actually was already present at Sinai. So it goes all the way back to this one great moment that really constitutes the peoplehood of the Jewish people. And we have, and that's really remarkable, I think, the last sentence where it says, "But both with those who are standing here with us this day before our God Adonai, and with those who are not with us here this day." So basically, even those who are technically, physically, in terms of the bodies, not here, they are somehow also present at Sinai. And of course, the rabbis will take up on that. And so we have source 2, the Midrash Tanchuma, that says, "Rabbi Abahu said in the name of Rabbi Samuel bar Nachmani, why does it say, those who are standing here and those who are not here, without using the word standing? Because all the souls were there, even when their bodies had still not been created." In other words, I was born in 1996. There's a good chance I did not have a body before then. And still, in some way, I remember Sinai, because my soul, according to this belief, was at Sinai, as were the souls of all the Jews. Which means that Sinai, as it actually says in the text above, is the crucial moment of the covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish people. All the Jews are supposed to have stood there, and God made the covenant with all the Jews and reinforced it actually at Sinai. Any questions or remarks or this is crazy screams so far? Okay. So what happened at Sinai? Let's go to source number 3 then. And the reason why I'm reading the Hebrew is that, especially for those who understand a little bit or a lot of Hebrew, there are certain central words that appear time and time again and are very confusing. So the first sentence is ויהי ביום השלישי בהיות הבוקר ויהי קולות וברקים וענן כבד על ההר וקול שופר חזק מאוד ויחרד כל העם אשר במחנה. We have the word kol here twice already. And the English is, on the third day as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning and a dense cloud upon the mountain and a very loud blast of the horn, and all the people who were in the camp trembled. So this is really, it's literally an awesome or awful experience for the people. It's quite frightening. And the word kol here is used twice, as I said. Once, kolot uvrakim, the thunder and the lightning. Kolot is as thunder. And once as the kol shofar, the voice or the sound of the shofar horn, like what we blast on Yom Kippur, when there was a similar thing going on at Mount Sinai. But kol appears, as I said, time and time again in those passages. So the next Hebrew line would be, source 4, ויהי קול השופר הולך וחזק מאוד משה ידבר והאלוהים יעננו בקול, which in English means the blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in kol. So the question here really is, so we have the kol shofar, the blast of the shofar, the sound of the shofar. We have the kol, which also means the thunder. And we have Moses calling to God and God answering him in kol. And kol can mean a voice. That might be what we would expect here, God saying or answering Moses exactly what he has to do, exactly what he has to know. But it can also mean thunder, and it can also mean the sound of the shofar. And the professor I mentioned earlier, Professor Benjamin Summer, who wrote a whole book on this topic basically, says that this ambiguity in the text is intentional. The text the text wants us to wonder what actually happened. It does not want us to have a clear answer, according to this scholar. And it goes on in a similar vein. So in 5 in the Hebrew we would have וכל העם רואים את הקולות ואת הלפידים ואת קול השופר ואת ההר עשן וירא העם וינועו ויעמדו מרחוק. All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. So, in addition to this whole ambiguity of kol, we have another problem now, because it says, v'chol ha'am, the whole people, ro'im et hakolot. For those of you who know Hebrew, ro'im, who knows what ro'im normally would mean? To see. So how do you see the blast of the shofar? We would expect the text to say they heard the blast of the shofar. They don't see the sound, they hear the sound. So what is going on here? Before we answer that question, let's continue a little bit in our fun Hebrew game. As it says in source 6. ויאמר אדוני אל משה, כה תאמר אל בני ישראל, אתם ראיתם, כי מן השמיים דיברתי עמכם. Adonai spoke to you, Adonai said to Moses, thus shall you say to the Israelites, you yourself saw that I spoke to you from the very heavens. So again, the same problem. How can it say, Re'item, you saw this as I spoke, as God spoke to you? You heard that I spoke to you. You didn't see that I spoke to you. What is going on here? We might get a hint for that in another verse, in source 7. וידבר אדוני אליכם מתוך האש, כל דברים אתם שומעים, ותמונה אינכם רואים, זולתי קול. So again we have kol twice. And it means, Adonai spoke to you out of the fire. So all of a sudden we don't have the thunder and the lightning and the arafel, the cloud and so on anymore. We have fire. And God speaks out of the fire. So maybe the people can see the fire. You heard the sound of words, but perceived no shape, nothing but a call, but a voice. And now we're getting to a fascinating interpretation of that whole thing by the famous Rabbi Akiva. But in order for us to understand what Akiva is saying, we need to go to a psalm that we actually know, especially from Shabbat, where we have the line, Kol Adonai chotzev lavot esh, and the melody would go on, da 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 da. And it means in English, the voice of the Lord kindles flames of fire. So now we are in this theme of fire. And the Midrash, is it Mechilta Midrash? Okay, the Midrash says, and all the people saw the thunder. They saw what was visible and heard what was audible. These are the words of Rabbi Ishmael. Rabbi Akiva says, they saw and heard that which was visible. They did both, in other words. They saw and they heard. Also, they saw the fiery word, commandment, coming out from the mouth of the Almighty, as it was struck upon the tablets. As it is said, the voice of the Lord hewed out flames of fire. So Akiva uses this whole imagery of the fire and imagines God speaking fire into the tablet, so to say. It's really like, it sounds pretty fantastic. It sounds pretty awesome. As it says, like, they saw the fiery word coming out from the mouth of the Almighty as it was struck upon the tablets. So that's one interpretation of what might have had happened at Sinai. But there are more interpretations. What might be the problem if we think or if we say that God spoke certain words to human beings? What do you think might be problematic from a theological perspective about that? How would we imagine God? Have you ever seen God have a mouth or be actually saying words to people? Like, for me personally, this always feels a bit strange. I know there are a lot of people who actually believe that, but there are also a lot of people who say, this sounds very strange. And one of those people was the famous Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, who lived, I think, in 1st century Common Era. Thanks. And Philo said, for we are told that all the people saw the voice. So again our problem of what does it mean to see a voice? Not that they heard it, for what was happening was not an impact of air made by the organs of mouth and tongue, but virtue shining with intense brilliance. That's a Platonic ancient Greek idea of the virtue as something, it's a great entity, so to say. But the voice or sound that was not that of verbs and nouns, but of God, seen by the eye of the soul, he rightly represents as visible. This shows that the words spoken by God are interpreted by the power of sight residing in the soul. So Philo says, I don't really believe that God has a mouth and speaks words like normal human beings, but the text must mean something else. And that is exactly why we have this wording of all the people saw the voice. And what he does in this ancient Greek Jewish fashion is to say this is the soul, which is sort of a sublime part of human beings, seeing with the eye of the soul. And this is a particular kind of seeing, and in that sense the soul sees the word. It's not that our eyes, or the eyes of the Jews saw it, it's the soul that sees. The other problem with that whole idea is that different human beings perceive words differently. So when we say that God spoke to the people, I think another thing for us to be on the lookout for, so to say, is the question of how did the people hear it then? What I mean is this. While I'm talking to you, probably everybody of you takes something else away from the words I'm saying. Because every human being interprets words differently. And there's a great likelihood that the Jewish people did the same thing at Sinai. And so the Midrash Shmot Rabbah takes up on that. How am I on time, Rabbi Wiener? Okay. So, and the Midrash says, come and see how the voice of God at Mount Sinai would go out among all of Israel, each and every one according to their strength. For the sake of time, I will skip the rest, but this Midrash is basically saying every Jewish person who was there received the words of God in a different way, because every human being is individual, is different, and therefore it must be, according to this Midrash, that they all perceive the words of God in the different strengths. And the Hasidic rabbis way later would pick up on this idea and would really make a big point of this thing, that like human beings, the Jews must have perceived the words of God in a myriad of ways, because every path to God is different, and everybody receives the words of God differently, since we're all human. And the last idea that I would like to introduce, to make things even a little bit more confusing, as they already are, is the idea of the revelation being an act of almost physical love. So there's a text called Song of Songs Rabbah, another Midrash, and it's an interpretation of the famous Song of Songs, and the Song of Songs is the text about the loving relationship, quite physically almost loving relationship between God and the Jewish people. And it says, "Oh, give me of the kisses of your mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine," in Song of Songs. And what the Midrash does is this. It says, Rabbi Yochanan said, it was stated in Sinai, as it is stated, "Let him kiss me from the kisses of his mouth." What Rabbi Yochanan doing here is probably that he's saying, the verse in Song of Songs, "Kiss me with the kisses of your mouth," is actually a very deep mystical description of what happened at Sinai. Because Sinai was nothing else but the kiss of God at the soul of the Jews, as the great Magd of Mezrich would later say. So Sinai here is not so much a verbal revelation, but really it's this kiss of God at the soul of the Jews. And then it goes on. Rabbi Azariah, Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Shimon, in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, adopted this approach, said, it is written, Moses commanded us the Torah. The whole Torah in its entirety is 613 commandments. In terms of numerical value, Torah totals 611 mitzvot that Moses spoke to us. However, Anochi, which is the first of the 10 commandments, it means I, and Lo yeh lecha, which is the beginning of the second commandment of the 10 commandments, and means you shall not have other gods. we did not hear from the mouth of Moses, but rather from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be he. In other words, we have 613 commandments according to Jewish tradition. Rabbi Azariah and Rabbi Yehuda ben Rabbi Shimon make quite a radical statement. They say, out of those 613 commandments, 611 were given by Moses, basically, as the messenger of God, or through Moses, I should rather say. And only 2 of those commandments the people directly heard from God. Even out of the 10 commandments, only 2 of the 10 commandments the people heard directly from God, which is, I am your God, and you shall not have other gods beside me. This is quite an extreme statement, and we will understand it better if we look at the medieval rabbi Ramban or Nachmanides, who picks up on the structure that we have right after the 10 Commandments in the Torah. As it says in the second book of Moses, after the 10 Commandments. ויאמרו אל משה דבר אתה עמנו ונשמעה ואל ידבר עמנו אלוהים פן נמות. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey, but let not God speak to us, lest we die. So the people know that if you speak too much to God, you die. And what I feel like might actually have been a very sneaky way to get rid of Moses, they say to Moses, okay, you speak to God. We don't want to speak with God, it's too frightening. You go and speak to God. And Ramban picks up on this. And he says, in the opinion of the commentators, this happened after the giving of the Torah. So when Ramban says, most rabbis say that we have the 10 Commandments, the Torah is given, and only later the people say, this is really frightening. Please, Moses, go you, and you shall be our messenger, and God shall speak to you. But such is not my opinion, for it says here, but let not God speak with us. And it does not say anymore. In the Hebrew that would be, ואל ידבר עמנו אלוהים פן נמות. Instead of, אל ירבה לדבר עמנו, or anything like this. In other words, there is a word missing in the Hebrew. There is anything that indicates something like anymore, like more. And Ramban picks up on this and he says, if the people at any of the 10 Commandments, it would say, we don't want to hear any more of this. But it doesn't say that. The correct interpretation regarding the section of the Torah and the entire order of events pertaining to the revelation appears to me to be as follows. And all the people perceived, and they said unto Moses, all this happened before the revelation. And now scripture refers back, meaning you have the 10 Commandments, and then you have the verse saying, Moses, you speak to God. But Ramban says, no, actually, in reality, what happened is, they first said to Moses, you speak to God, and then there were the 10 Commandments, which is based on a difficult grammatical thing, but he is all right to say that. And now scripture refers back and mentions the words of the people to Moses, relating that from the moment they had perceived the thunderings and the lightnings, they moved backwards and stood afar off, further away from the boundary of the mountain that Moses had set for them. So the people already earlier stood from afar and had Moses speak to God. And since we are not a lot of people, I will share my own take on what happened at Sinai, which is based on Rabbi Menachem ben Mendel, the Ribshitzer Rebbe, who apparently said that all the people heard was the Aleph of Anochi, was the first letter of the 10 Commandments, and Anochi is I. So the sentence goes, I am your God, and so on, and all they heard was the Aleph of the I. And the Aleph, as you might imagine, actually is a guttural, which means you cannot really hear it. And what he says is that they saw the Aleph in the face of each other, which means that they looked at each other the way I understand it, and they understood that they're all created by God. And so the divine revealed itself, God revealed God's self through the Jewish people at Sinai. However we understand Sinai though, one thing is important, and I think Pirkei Avot puts it very beautifully. As it says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, every day a bat kol, a heavenly voice, goes forth from Mount Chorev, in other words, from Mount Sinai. In other words, every day we should be able to hear the voice of God coming forth to us from Mount Sinai. And it's up to us to listen to God's voice. So what I learned from it, and maybe you too, is that all Jews, including converts, share a common memory of the revelation of God's words at Mount Sinai. We all have this foundational memory. But the memory of what precisely happened, and even the very experiences at Mount Sinai, vary from person to person. While we should remain loyal to the commitments of the Jewish people, remembering Sinai should remind us that we should never hold fundamentalist views on what God truly wants from us. Because we know that even as we remember Sinai, what exactly that means is intentionally and forever ambiguous. We begin to you.
Friends, I want to thank Sammy Vingran for leading us in the final session this evening. I want to thank all of you for joining us for our annual Tikkun, Leil, Shavuot. It's wonderful to be back in the building for Shavuot. It's wonderful to be back in the building with food for Shavuot. I want to wish you all a Chag Sameach. I'd like to remind you that tomorrow morning we're davening at 9:30 in the morning. And Shabbat morning for the second day of Shavuot will be at 9:30 in the morning as well. And Yisrael will be observed. There'll be no Kabbalat Shabbat on Zoom tomorrow evening on Friday night, or Zoom that next week. Chag Sameach, and thank you for joining us tonight. Sim-